All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this symposium. Very excited to have you here. We're going to start with a talk by Dr. Ann Gleig from University of Central Florida. She's going to be discussing her research on Buddhist communities and race and what folks need to do their own work. So please welcome Dr. Ann Gleig.
Everyone. So I always like to start my talks with some thank yous and acknowledgements. I want to thank Dr. Anningson and the School of Religion for the invitation to speak. It's a real honour to be invited alongside Dr. Krishnamurti today. I want to thank all of the Buddhists of colour who gave me their time and trust while I've been conducting field work on this topic. It's crucial to acknowledge that my research is completely dependent upon their decades-long efforts to transform the white space of American convert lineages. And as a white researcher, it's been intellectually and ethically transformative to contextualize their work. I want to stress that the work on racial justice in Buddhism is a collective endeavor, and my research rests on that of many of my colleagues and friends. And today I particularly want to acknowledge two of them, Dr. Nalika Gajavira, whose project, Transforming the American Sangha, Race, Racism and Diversity in North American Sanghas, I'm fortunate enough to be contributing to. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Rima Besley-Flagg's new book on Black Buddhists, which is coming out this month. I also want to thank Dr. Jeff Wilson, who's at the University of Waterloo. And he's been a real support to me in this work, and he also was the advisor of Dr. Anningson. So Dr. Wilson really models what it means to support racial justice work as a white person without centering oneself. So I think it's important to give him a shout out. Okay, so I'm going to turn to my talk. Okay, so Steve. Scary postmodern virus infects North American Buddhism. Me. Thanks for showing us what POC Buddhists have to deal with every day in their sanghas, Steve. Steve, keep playing the victim. Me. I notice your Twitter profile says Zen beginner. Maybe you could learn something from the Zen teachers in this book who have been practicing for decades. Stretch that Zen mind, beginner's mind, Steve. Steve deletes thread and blocks me. So the proceeding was a short exchange that I had with Steve, a stranger, on Twitter, after I tweeted about the publication of George Yancey and Emily McRae's 2019 collection, Buddhism and Whiteness. The book contains essays by Buddhist scholars and practitioners examining both how whiteness operates in Buddhist practice and academic communities, and what resources Buddhism offers for challenging whiteness. While this was the first academic contribution, Buddhists of colour have been confronting whiteness in American Buddhism for over 3 decades. So the landmark 20,000 compilation, Making the Invisible Visible, Healing Racism in Our Buddhist Communities, for instance, shared that for many years, the dominant white Euro-American Sangha had been resistant to efforts by people of colour to raise awareness of racism in their communities. So during my ethnographic research with these communities, I discovered that they were repeatedly told by white Buddhists that racial justice work was not real Buddhism and was either irrelevant or in actual opposition to the tradition. Now, when I began to publish my research on these efforts, I also began to encounter similar objections. As you can see from my exchange with Steve, I have responded to these objections directly and critically, moving from describing and contextualizing racial justice in American Buddhism to defending and advocating for it. So today, I want to show how white supremacy has been challenged in both American Buddhism and Buddhist studies. First, I'll discuss racial justice efforts in American Buddhism, including calls for white Buddhists to take responsibility for tackling white supremacy. Next, I'll identify some of the white Buddhist backlash to these initiatives. And finally, I'll ask, what is the role and responsibility of white Buddhist studies scholars in particular, given the colonial history of our discipline? So in their recent article, anthropologists of religion, Rachel Snyder and Sophie Bjork-James, argue that increased scholarship on race, religion, and whiteness has the potential to support the work of dismantling white supremacy. I'll discuss the multiple ways Buddhist scholars can, are, and should be responding to Schneider and Bjork-James's request to, quote, offer insights into the limits and possibilities of constructing forms of religion or spirituality beyond white supremacy, end quote. Okay, so I'm going to go really broad today, which does risk losing some detail, but I think we'll speak to more people outside of Buddhist studies, and hopefully we can fill in some of the detail in the Q&A. Okay, so what is whiteness? So much of the current work on whiteness comes from the interdisciplinary academic fields of critical race theory and critical whiteness studies, which emerged in the 1980s and 90s. It's important to acknowledge, however, that before critical whiteness studies existed as a distinct subfield, African American historians and literary figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison were naming whiteness and its harm. As Gregory J. notes, as Gregory J. notes, critical whiteness studies attempts to trace the economic and political history behind the invention of whiteness, to challenge the privileges given to so-called whites, and to analyze the cultural practices that create and perpetuate the fiction of whiteness. So in emphasizing the historic contingent construction of whiteness then, the field distinguishes between whiteness as a social practice and form of conditioning and white-skinned people. While white-skinned people are conditioned by whiteness and benefit from it at the expense of those deemed non-white, they are not reducible to it. The normative aim of CWS then is to undo whiteness as a form of social, cultural, political, and existential domination. So one of the main contributions of CWS has been to trace the historic production of whiteness and the cultural practices that have maintained it. In his book, The Invention of the White Race, for instance, historian Theodore Allen shows that the term white race first appears in colonial documents in Virginia in the 1660s. Allen demonstrates that the elite landowning class used this category as a tool to divide poor white and black indentured servants. Poor white servants were offered freedom and land, for instance, if they worked as white slave patrols against black rebellions. So during this same period, a series of slave laws that successively dehumanized African people and produced the institution of chattel slavery were passed. The 1790 Naturalization Act conflated whiteness and American by granting citizenship only to white males over the age of 21. After slavery was abolished in 1865, white supremacy reconfigured itself through a series of local and state laws known as the Jim Crow laws that legalized racial segregation and produced racial terror and harm. Between 1886 and 1925, different groups of European immigrants slowly assimilated into whiteness, as book titles such as How the Irish Became White show. These immigrants became white by participating in and thereby maintaining the system of white supremacy. So other scholars have focused on how whiteness has been reproduced through a variety of cultural policies and practices after the civil rights movement in the 1960s, A key work here is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, which shows how Black Americans have been targeted through policies such as the war on drugs, and how the US criminal justice systems functions as a system of racial control and dominance. Authors such as Robert DiAngelo provide data that shows a continuing dominance of white-skinned people in positions of cultural authority and influence. And we can see the ongoing impact and cost of white supremacy on the health and well-being of Black and Brown Americans. So summing up, as Eric Tranby and Douglas Hartman note, some of the key analytic insights of critical whiteness study are the one, recognition that the Jim Crow era of white supremacy has been replaced by a subtler legitimation of structural dominance. Two, the construction of white identity as normative, ahistorical, and universal. And three, the centrality of individualistic ideals to whiteness. Okay, so how has whiteness showed up in American Buddhism? Okay, so one major way that whiteness has operated is through the marginalization and exclusion of Asian American heritage communities from mainstream narratives of Buddhism in North America. Buddhism was brought to the US by Chinese and Japanese immigrants in the mid and late 19th century. The first Buddhist temple in America was built by a Japanese American society, and the first Buddhist organization was the Japanese Buddhist Churches of America, which was started by Jodo Shinshu School of Japanese Buddhism. Now, both communities face considerable racist discrimination and violence, including the destruction of their temples, lynchings, and culminating in the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese American community were forced to leave their homes and placed into US concentration internment camps. Buddhist leaders were classified as a threat to national security, and Buddhist faith was labeled as un-American. In his recent book, American Sutra, Duncan Williams has shown the great lengths Japanese Buddhists went to preserve their Buddhist faith during this period of persecution. Despite establishing and preserving Buddhism in the US under these incredibly hostile circumstances, Asian American heritage Buddhists have been erased from the story of Buddhism by white converts. Take, for example, former Tricycle, so a famous Buddhist magazine, editor Helen Tworkoff's comments. Reiterating a common white Buddhist narrative, she declared, quote, "The spokespeople for Buddhism in America have been almost exclusively educated members of the white middle class. Asian American Buddhists so far have not figured prominently in the development of something called Buddhism in America," end quote. So such a statement reproduces the equation of whiteness with American, and it takes white identity as normative. A similar white dominance is on display in representations of the tradition. So despite making up roughly two-thirds of Buddhists in the United States, Asian Americans have been consistently underrepresented in mainstream depictions. Writing under the moniker of Angry Asian Buddhist, Aaron J. Lee noted that Asian Buddhist writers were 3 times less likely than white Buddhists to appear in major Western Buddhist publications. And here we can recall the data on white supremacy that I showed in the previous slide. So disrupting this white supremacy, scholars such as Fumi Su have called for a recognition of Asian American Buddhists and for white American Buddhists to confront racism as an integral part of their Buddhist practice, while Chen Xing Han explodes Orientalist stereotypes by presenting a rich array of young Asian American Buddhist voices in her excellent book, Be the Refuge. Today, though, I want to focus on how whiteness has operated specifically within my own research populations, which I refer to as meditation-based lineage convert Buddhists. It's quite a mouthful, sorry, but there's different types of converts, so it's important to discriminate. These communities have their immediate origins in the cross-cultural flows between Asia and North America, in the 1960s. During this period, Asian Buddhist teachers came to the US, often to serve Asian heritage communities, and founded major convert lineages. One of these was the Japanese Soto Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki, who established Tassajara, which was the first Zen training monastery outside of Japan, and the San Francisco Zen Center, which is one of the most influential Zen centers in the US. Similarly, white Americans traveled to Asia, where they trained under monastic and lay teachers before returning home to start their own centers. Joseph Goldstein, Jack Cornfield, Sharon Salzberg, and Jacqueline Schwartz-Mandel, all featured here, for instance, co-founded the Insight Meditation Society in May 1975. Now, the first wave of academic scholarship on these communities was published around the turn of the millennium, 20 years ago, as the study of Buddhism in America emerged as a distinct subfield from the wider field of Buddhist studies. Cutting across different denominations of Insight, Tibetan, and Zen, these communities were characterized by a strong focus on meditation practice and philosophy. They tended to de-emphasize cosmological, devotional, and ritual elements, and they were psychologically oriented. They were individualistic with a lack of interest in community building. Participants were overwhelmingly white, middle to upper class, and tended to be politically liberal. Within these communities, there has been a democratization of power structures with an increasing number of female teachers, but little attention to class or racial difference. Now, while scholars such as Wacko, Shannon Hickey have problematized and undone the two Buddhism typology, which is used to distinguish meditation-based convert lineages from Asian American heritage communities, the normative whiteness of the former is indisputable. Indeed, around the same time as that first wave of scholarship was published, a group of POC practitioners and their white allies presented Making the Invisible Visible. This compilation declared that for many years, Euro-American middle-class sangers had been resistant to their efforts to raise awareness of racism, and interweaving personal experiences of racism with Buddhist teachings and critical race theory, this landmark collection offered a number of resources to combat racism within Buddhism. Now, one of the co-authors of Making the Invisible Visible, it was Larry Yang. He's an Asian American teacher who has been at the forefront of racial justice in the Insight community. One of Yang's many contributions include collecting first-person narratives of the experiences of people of color in Insight spaces. One example comes from Yang himself. Describing his first retreat experience, he explains, quote, "All I could focus on was that I was the only person of color in about 100 people, and how awkward, lonely, and even unsafe I felt. Of course, my experience was partially due to my own psychological conditioning at the time, itself socially influenced, but it was also due to the external conditions, hence where whiteness resides, the external conditions of how the teachings, teachers, community and organization was manifested." Another was from an African-American practitioner who noted the response from white teachers and leaders when they tried to discuss their experiences. In their words, quote, "Helpful as I found Buddhism, I also experienced some painful misunderstandings. when white Dharma teachers, instructors, and yogis seem to be threatened or baffled by my bringing up of experiences with racism. Why would they be interested? Don't they have their own churches? One visiting Dharma teacher asked me. So, okay, so I just want to bring in the voices of some POC Buddhists there. Okay, so how has whiteness been challenged? Let's see. So, making the invisible visible is just one of a number of initiatives by POC Buddhists over the last 3 decades to overcome whiteness. One major area has been to raise awareness through forums and literature. Examples here include the 204 Dharma, Colour and Culture, New Voices in Western Buddhism, which is the first collection to bring together the voices of Western Buddhist practitioners of colour. Another are the Buddha Dharma forums. Why is American Buddhism so white? A second area is the emergence of people of colour specific retreats and sitting groups known as affinity groups. So in August 2002, Spirit Rock hosted the first ever African American Dharma retreat and conference. They've held POC specific events almost annually since. Primary and secondary sources on affinity spaces show that they function as an essential space of safety and belonging for Buddhists of colour, as well as enable them to strengthen community and explore the relevance of the Dharma to their lives as racialized subjects in the US. And Dr. Rima Vesely-Flatt's book on Black Buddhists really, is an amazing, has amazing ethnographic depth in this area. So I encourage you all to check out her book. A third area is the emergence of POC teachers who are really actively promoting racial justice initiatives. It's impossible to acknowledge them all here, but pioneers include the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Jan Willis, more recently Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams and Lama Rod Owens have been really making a big impact. Closely related is the development of communities with specific attention to issues of multiculturalism and racial justice. And at the very forefront of these is the East Bay Meditation Society in Oakland, California. It began in 2008 with a specific mission to unite the wisdom of Buddhism with social justice and radical inclusivity. I'll be happy to share slides, by the way, with anyone who's interested. Similarly, there is the impact of non-sectarian Buddhist organizations that have taken up racial justice as a major concern. The Buddhist Peace Fellowship has a long history here, and a new organization is Dharma Relief, which is started a long-term project called Healing Race Relations to redress racism and provide the means to support Black people in healing racial trauma. A sixth area is the adoption of diversity, inclusion and equity plans in major Buddhist centers. I don't know if you can see, it's quite small, sorry. But this is a report from a major center, Insight Meditation Society, which was that center that I showed you the picture from 1975 of the things they've been doing institutionally. Now, one of the major needs identified by Buddhists of colour within white dominant convert spaces is representation of people of colour at the highest levels of leadership, which is, basically the retreat teachers. In 2017, Larry Yang found that between 350 and 375 certified Western Insight teachers, only 10 to 11 identified as people of colour. So he and Gina Shaw, who were later joined by Kate Wheeler, initiated a POC-focused teacher training program. Now, the history of that program is quite painful, and it essentially itself became the target of white institutional resistance. But the end result was that there were two separate teacher training programs. One, which is featured here, was led by Yang, Shaw and Wheeler, at Spirit Rock, which had 90% of the participants identified as BIPOC. And then the IMS one, I think, had, 75%. Now, combined, the programs resulted in 32 teachers of colour, which was an increase of 330% of teachers. And Dr. Nalika Gajavira, who I mentioned at the start, is kind of tracking the kind of trajectory of those teachers. So again, stay tuned for more work here. Okay, then another really important area is the development of anti-racist Buddhist teachings and practices. And it's crucial to note that for Buddhists of colour, racial justice work is an expression and an extension of Buddhist practice. They see it as absolutely central to being Buddhist, right? And as a result, central to their work has been the development of multiple Buddhist hermeneutics of racial justice, which interpret Buddhist doctrine through the lived experience, through the lived bodies of marginalized practitioners of colour. And while differing across lineages, because Buddhist lineages have their own, kind of emphasis, these emergent Buddhologies tend to advance a collective understanding of foundational notions, of Buddhist teaching, such as dukkha, pain, unsatisfactoriness, suffering, karma, and liberation. So just think back to whiteness and individualism, and then you can kind of get a sense that these collective Buddhologies are kind of interrupting that individualism. So Buddhists of colour have also called on white Buddhist siblings to do their own work in confronting whiteness. As Lars Sarmiento, the founder of the POC affinity group at Insight Meditation of Washington, shared with me in an interview, quote, "Talking to white folks is pretty painful and exhausting. That's why white folks need to start doing their own work and not rely on folks of colour to educate them." So this is a quote that I titled my talk with. So one response then from white folk has been the increasing production of what I call white awareness literature. These are reflections that interweave personal narrative, data on structural racism and Buddhist teachings, and they've appeared in various primary forms. They name whiteness as a form of conditioning, like we saw from critical whiteness studies, that is also not just culturally, politically, and economically harmful, but also is a harmful barrier to Buddhist liberation. Another is the emergence also of white awareness affinity groups, and in which white practitioners explore their own white conditioning and identity in a wider Buddhist context. And thus far, the earliest example of one of these groups that I found was a program that was co-developed at the East Bay Meditation Center, that center that started in 2008, called Interconnected, Being Mindful and White in a Multicultural World. And the co-developer, Kitsi Sean, explained to me, quote, "It was so clear from the start at the East Bay Meditation Center that a lot of white folks were so excited to be in a more diverse space, but they didn't have the awareness or skills to not enact our privilege." So, end quote. So here, white awareness work is articulated both as a pragmatic practice of what does it mean to come together in multiracial communities in a way that white folk don't do more harm, and also as a soteriological practice. So Reverend Kyodo Williams emphasizes, for instance, that white practitioners, just as Buddhist practitioners of colour, need to understand this work as essential to their own liberation in Buddhist terms. Okay, so while some white Buddhists have responded to calls for racial justice, there remains both apathy and also active opposition to such work. So I'm going to give you a few of the backlashes. So the first is a refusal to listen to Buddhists of colour and recognise the reality of racism. In fact, in a reverse racism narrative, Buddhists of colour are often accused themselves of being racist. So one of the many complaints lodged against Spoonie Sue's excellent piece, we've been here all along, for instance, was the charge that, quote, this article is implicitly racist towards white people. And I was called a 21st century George Wallace for my research supporting affinity spaces, which were labeled as segregated spaces. Now, a second opposition occurs through an apolitical hermeneutics of Buddhism, in which racial justice work is deemed as political and therefore irrelevant to Buddhist practice, which is seen as apolitical. Inside teachers shared, for instance, that students walk out of the room when they discuss racism in their Dharma talks and complain afterwards that they are coming to meditate, not for political discussion. Now, in many cases, the apolitical opposition becomes particularized, so that the problem is not that Buddhists of color are politicizing the Dharma, but they are wrongly politicizing the Dharma. And in short, this is the claim that racial justice represents a Marxist, neo-postmodern Marxist, cultural Marxist takeover of Buddhism. And in a recent co-article written with Brenna Grace Artinga, we pass out 3 positions, all of which they compatible with left-wing progressive values. And this is often linked with claims of a lack of textual precedence, in which it's claimed that there's no textual support. So essentially, there's a lot of different ahistoric and very selective readings of Buddhism that are mobilized in support of this white Buddhist backlash. And I'll get into that a little bit. Okay, so just with an eye on the time, let's see. So, scholars, how have scholars been complicit in and challenge whiteness? So, let me get that back up. So, one would imagine that the ahistorical and selective interpretations of Buddhism that are articulated in the white backlash to racial justice would be easily disrupted by scholars. However, Buddhist studies as a field has actually been complicit in the production of what Richard Payne pointedly calls white Buddhism. So scholars such as Joseph Shea and Natalie Cooley have shown that Orientalist constructions of what does and does not count as real Buddhism have resulted in the marginalization of Asian American and Western convert Buddhists, whose practices do not conform to text-centered Buddhism. Shea, for instance, illuminates a legacy of white supremacy from the Western Orientalist racialized re-articulation of Asian Buddhism in the late and middle Victorian era to the present day neglect of lived communities of Asian American Buddhists. And Orientalists were writing at a time in which Enlightenment, social Darwinism, and eugenic conceptions of race were prevalent in Europe and North America. Shea argues that Orientalists' racial re-articulation of Asian Buddhism were intricately linked to these racist discourses. Dr. Anningson's written a terrific book about this. Orientalist scholars dismiss the ritual, merit-making, and devotional aspects of Buddhism as superstitious and cultural overlays that have distorted real Buddhism. In their ethnocentric arrogance, they declared that Asian Buddhists were ignorant of true Buddhism, which only the objective scholarship employed by white philologists could recover. Now, Asian monastic elites were also complicit in granting authority to such perspectives. Natalie Cooley, for example, shows how Henry Steele Alcock's Protestant Buddhism was legitimated through the traditional authority of the Sinhalese Sangha. The collusion between Asian monastic elites and white scholars to produce and police real Buddhism and the consequences that has had for marginalized, racialized and gender Buddhists has been illuminated by Sharon Su. In Being Buddhist in a Christian World, Gender and Community in a Korean American Temple, shows that Korean American females have been doubly marginalized in Buddhist communities and Buddhist studies. First, as Korean Americans who receive scant scholarly attention, and second, as lay females who approach Buddhism as an emotional embodied practice rather than intellectual text-centered activity. So just kind of think of the parallels between Black Buddhists who are being told they're not doing real Buddhists because their Buddhism isn't in the Pali Canon. You can see the continuation. So in the next book, Silver Screen Buddhist, Sue continues to forefront marginalized Buddhist bodies. She decenters the primacy of the ascetic meditating monk as the ideal Buddhist body and brings the historically neglected population of lay Buddhist women to the forefront. So for Sue, the privileging of male monasticism as the purest form of Buddhism is a result of both the elitism and patriarchy of the tradition and an outcome of Orientalism and white privilege. She calls on scholars to undo the interrelated hierarchies of whiteness and patriarchy to recover Buddhism's marginalized others. So, it's on paper. So in conclusion, I want to offer some of the different ways that scholars have and can respond to Sue's call. How can we disrupt whiteness? How can we disrupt patriarchy? So the first thing that is needed is to recognize that for white, that especially for white scholars, because especially as a white scholar, I wanted to address my, other white scholars, is to recognize our role and responsibility. So here I want to lift up Dr. Anningson's approach as an example. And in the introduction to his book on the Aryanization of Buddhism, Anningson acknowledges both his literal and symbolic complicity in colonialism. First, he traces a family member who worked for the East India Trading Company, which was a major player in the colonization of India. And second, he recognizes that it was intellectual white men just like him who constructed racialized views of Buddhism. So given these personal and professional inheritances, he concludes that he has an ethical responsibility to engage in scholarship that disrupts the continuation of colonialism and racism. And as he puts it, quote, "To live in the US is to become part of the system of racecraft. We must engage in anti-racism as an ethical imperative." So I could not agree more with Anningson, and that's not just because he invited me, honest. Like him, I've made an intentional commitment to anti-racist scholarship. Here's a couple of pieces in which I, kind of speak back and contextualize and critique the white Buddhist backlash, speaking both to fellow academics and also to fellow Buddhist practitioners, because I also practice Buddhism. So once committed to anti-racist scholarship, there are a number of different methodological and theoretical avenues by which to proceed. I'm kind of talking to other Buddhist studies scholars here, because not everyone's an ethnographer, right, like me, or a historian. So one approach is to disrupt the privileging of monastic elites and canonical texts as a standard of real Buddhism, and to focus rather on the lived practice of marginalized Buddhists from the pre-modern to the present. This approach is in fact advocated by Amy Langenberg and Steph Borkwell under their initiative, the Buddhist Bodies Collective. Now, writing as part of this collective and also outside of the collective, one good example here is Nicholas Witowski's work on lower caste monastics and early Buddhism. And this is a project he frames as part of this wider project to rescue, recover non-elite forms of Buddhism. So despite texts in which the Buddha challenges caste, due to the political and social power of Brahmins, all religious groups, including Buddhists, actually sought to exclude lower and outcasts from their ranks. Focusing on the 2nd century CE, Witowski shows how upper-class Brahma monastics attempted to discipline what he calls the ascetic fraternities of lower and outcast monastics and kind of erase them from the monastic codes. Now, Witowski turns to African-American studies professor Saida Hartman's study Wayward Lives of post-slavery life in the US, and he kind of draws parallels here between the surveillance and regulation of the subaltern caste monastics and the surveillance and regulation of the bodies of young Black women under racist and misogynist regimes. And as Witowski notes, making visible pre-modern marginalized Buddhists can support both contemporary anti-caste and contemporary anti-racist activism. And indeed, at the 2011 AAR session, Revisiting Dharma, Neglected Histories and Possible Futures of Buddhist Philosophy, scholars working on Dalit Buddhists and scholars working on Black Buddhists, including Rima Vasily-Flatt, who's a wonderful colleague and friend, really came into a very exciting conversation to discuss how a focus on race, caste and justice could open up new avenues in Buddhist philosophy. So another approach is to work with canonical texts, but in a new way, and show how Buddhist philosophy, as well as history, offers continuity and support for contemporary anti-racist efforts. So Buddhist philosopher Joy Brennan, for instance, calls on her colleagues to think anew the responsibilities of philology. As she explains, quote, excuse me, doing a genealogy of philology should free us from a narrow reception of old texts and encourage us to ask different questions of them and to bring them to bear on current issues in new generative ways. This is a particularly potent way for philosophers to disrupt the claiming of canonical Buddhism as fixed in the past and inherently conservative. And indeed, alt-right Buddhists, self-identified alt-right Buddhists, often turn to canonical scholarship to delegitimate anti-racist efforts. So this is a really super important intervention. So Brennan herself employs this approach in her scholarship. And while confronting whiteness is often dismissed, right? It's often said that's an intrusion of progressive values. She shows how Yogacara philosophy offers a rich framework for and also an imperative to do such work. Moreover, she's been sharing her work with a wider Buddhist audience. She's written a super article for Lion's Roar. I highly recommend it. And we've done some work, a couple of workshops together for white Buddhist communities, where we're essentially, combining our skills to try and kind of disrupt whiteness. So, as Brennan and I have argued elsewhere, whether employing ethnographic, historical, philological, or philosophical approaches in taking Buddhist anti-racist work seriously as legitimately Buddhist, and taking anti-racist work seriously as legitimate intellectual work, this is a pushback on it, unfortunately, scholars simultaneously grant it legitimacy, right? So some scholars might be uncomfortable with this, seeing it as a normative overstepping of intellectual parameters and a threat to the supposed scholarly ideal of objectivity. Such a position, Joy and I believe, is both naive and also irresponsible. It ignores the fact that Buddhist studies has always been involved in the construction of its objective study. And moreover, that such a construction has resulted and continues to result in harm for marginalized Buddhists. So our choice as scholars is not to have impact or not, but rather what impact will we have? Will our scholarship merely reproduce and recenter pre-existing elite power dynamics and demographics, or will it give voice to vulnerable populations at the margins? Put simply, will our scholarship perpetuate or support the work of dismantling white supremacy? Thank you. Sorry, that's a bit long. So it's longer to say it than you anticipated. Are we going to go to questions or straight to?
Yeah, let's do some. So we will have like the afternoon session, LS 333, for sort of larger discussions and broader questions. If anyone has some direct questions for Dr. Gleig about her presentation now, we can have some time for questions.
Well, I got a question. Was it okay? Did you follow it? There was a lot of information. How was it for the students? I'm always interested. Yeah, great.
Good, good. Yeah.
Quick question. One thing I wondered about in terms of contestation, this was framed around contesting whiteness in Buddhism and Buddhist studies. But I wondered, within the Asian heritage communities, vis-a-vis, those who came into Buddhism of a diverse racial background outside of Asian heritage communities, whether there is any kind of tension, maybe it's less so now, but historically, I wonder about, assimilating to whiteness, or asserting cultural authority on the basis of traditional heritage, vis-a-vis Black or brown and other, new kind of Buddhists. What kind of
well, a few things that I'll say is, first of all, of course, the category of Asian American Buddhism is certainly not a monolithic one. There's tremendous diversity within the category. And, one way of mapping that category has been to look at Asian American Buddhists from heritage communities and Asian American converts. So, for example, Larry Yang, who, it features quite heavily in my talk, and I work with him quite a bit. He's Asian American, but he came to Buddhism as a convert. So I think, Chenzing Han's book, Be the Refuge, really, just does a great job of really forefronting the diversity. So I just wanted to start with that. And then the second thing I'll say is, as within any community, there are, tensions that we might map onto, differences between more progressive and more conservative kind of, strands in the community and the tradition. So, as with, white convert groups, that you find both support and opposition or apathy to, say, Black Lives Matter, the same is true for Asian American heritage communities. So there's multiplicity. Essentially, there are, some Asian American Buddhists who are not as enthusiastic about racial justice. And there are Asian American, practitioners that are very, much part of a kind of, multiracial racial justice movement within American Buddhism across, the different religious and cultural groups within the broad signifier of, POC Buddhists. But with white Buddhists, so I'd say there's there's Asian Americans who are more conservative, who one might argue through a critical race lens, and people do argue that they are more assimilated to whiteness, and that, that they, that kind of leads to, the consideration of the model minority myth and how that's being used as a weaponization. I see lots of nods here against African Americans. So, for example, within my research populations, the Buddhist Peace Fellowship is an example of an organization that's been doing a lot of work to strengthen ties between African American and Asian American Buddhists. So, that maybe there's historically been, racism across both sides and pain and, kind of trauma. So I think, there is, that's all going on within Buddhism, within these Buddhist communities as well. And it's probably similar to what you find in maybe your research populations, And what I will say, which is, is that the white reactionary Buddhists who are, just inherently against racial justice, where they really love Asian, not just Asian American, more conservative, but Asian Buddhists who are nationalists. They really love those figures because they use them as legitimation of, you're not doing real Buddhism. So what you find is, this alignment across white and Asian right-wing populations, and Hindu Torah, I think, is a really good example. I was actually telling you yesterday that when I got, as part of the backlash that I've gotten for this research, some Hindu Torah people also got involved in it, which was, Dr. Krishnamurti will speak, I think, to that. So I think it's really, in my mind, it's not helpful to think about Asian and Western Buddhists. It's really essentializing. It's best to think of each form of Buddhism contemporary and also pre-modern with the work of people like Nicholas Witowski, that we can always think that there are elite Buddhists, right? And there are marginalized Buddhists. And so I've started to try and think more like elite and marginalized across categories of, say, caste, race, and gender as a disruption of reifying. Also, reifying engaged Buddhism is a white phenomena, and Asian Buddhists are conservative and so slow factional. It's quite tricky because the racialized rhetoric reproduces itself even in like resistance to it. It's like so many strands that unravel.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for that great question.
And also, I learned that I should definitely follow you on Twitter.
Yes. Well, I've actually just taken a 2-month break because I was kind of I was like spending like hours a day. But I will be back in force. I'm always up for a good Twitter fight. Yeah.
You might have mentioned it, and if you did, I'm sorry. So you mentioned that the first Buddhist temple was in San Francisco by a Chinese American Chinese society, and then the first Buddhist organization in America was a Japanese Buddhist church. So when did the shift between kind of a more Asian Buddhist community in the U.S. kind of shift to being predominantly white?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Sorry, I was looking for the slide in case you can ask me the dates, which I never remember.
I wrote the dates down.
So I think essentially, what happens is if you trace the history of Buddhism in America, it's really interesting because, when I teach world religions, I always ask my students, like, what's your associations with Buddhism? And what do you think they say? What do you imagine the associations are?
Like, I would think what you see in pop culture is more of like an Asian
center. And like meditating monk, they say it's
exactly.
a religion of peace, and it's it's like it's a good religion, right? And Islam's often the bad religion. But if you look historically, through the anti-immigrant waves that the Chinese and Japanese Buddhists in particular were subject to, Buddhism is really constructed, in a kind of it's a demonic, it's a religion of the pagans. But then it becomes kind of constructed as through Dr. Anderson is the guy that will tell you all of this. It becomes constructed in relationship to colonial discourses as a scientific religion, as a rational religion. So earlier on, when is it like what dates did you do? Like mid-19th century?
Yeah, mine's 1899.
A date guy, right? It starts to be constructed in a more positive light, but at the same time, as it's being constructed, you've still got this kind of, this kind of anti-immigration kind of hostility. But I think really the 60s, and maybe actually just a little before the 60s with the Beat Buddhists, that Buddhism starts to become really romanticized. But all of this time, the actual Asian American Buddhist communities aren't really in the picture. It's whiteness, it's white. Like I never knew of, the massively important role that Joju Shinsu played in kind of, housing the Beat Buddhists. I only knew like the Beat Buddhists. I only knew the white guys that claimed power got into Buddhism. Kind of a bit embarrassing to say this coming from a brain, to be honest, So at all stages, you see this erasure of actual Asian American Buddhists. But the 60s is really where it comes so to the forefront with the counterculture, I think. So that's a great question. Thank you so much. All right, I think we're time.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Okay, we'll get started with our second speaker. The second speaker today is Dr. Sailaja Krishnamurti. She's here from St. Mary's University in Halifax. And today she's going to be talking about race and religion in South Asia. So please welcome Dr. Krishnamurti.
I want to start my talk today with acknowledging the traditional caretakers of these lands, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nation. And I offer my respects to the land defenders and the water protectors across the country, across this land. As a person from a colonized place who also has caste privilege, this is something that I always think is important to reflect on before I begin to speak. When I think about the place where I am and how I came to be here. And I want to acknowledge with humility that the work of decolonization, which I think is a theme of much of our conversation today, is so I want to thank the School of Religion for inviting me to speak, and to Ron Emmington for organizing this event, and to Dr. Gleig for the amazing talk. I'm so excited to be here with you. It's my first in-person event in 2 years. Being in a room with human beings, it's really amazing. So thank you for having me. The title of my talk is Violent Tolerance, South Asians and the Racialization of Religion in Canada. And I chose this phrase, violent tolerance, because I was trying to think through how the notion of tolerance, in the context of the ways that we think about religious diversity in Canada, can be a kind of violence. Tolerance is not the same thing as acceptance, and it is not the same thing as love. It is not the same thing as consideration, learning. It is making space for, but implies an initial resistance. I'm like, okay, fine, I'll put it through. So it is, this idea of violent tolerance is also meant to think about how tolerance can be performed sometimes in violent ways. And I think violently tolerant is how I would characterize some of the discourse around how some Hindus are organizing and talking about themselves and their identities in North America today. So I'm going to start by showing you a couple of examples. I was reorganizing my slides as Dr. Rick was talking, because I was thinking, so this is so I'm just going to begin by finding this. So this is an article from 2017. This is a protest outside of the Peel District School Board in Mississauga, where there are a number of South Asian men, holding signs that say no religion in public schools, only sports and education. It's good to see what we're doing. And what it says on the in the screenshot I've included the article here. So this is an article from the Globe and Mail in 2017. At the beginning, it says 2 large paintings of the Hindu god Krishna are mounted on the wall of Ram Subramanian's living room. But he doesn't want to be labeled as a Hindu. What's his religion? Canadian, he says. His eyes lit up behind his glasses, punctuating his pride with a fist pump. It's Tuesday evening, and many of the dozens of South Asians who standing with that side of the Peel District School Board offices in Mississauga also worship the altar of the maple leaf and love singing that ancient hymn of Canada. I mean, there's definitely a pithiness to the way that this article frames the story, but I really am interested in what is happening at this moment of conjunction, where somebody who is a Hindu and is prominently demonstrating his Hinduness in his own space, right, is also publicly declaring himself to be Canadian first. And in doing that is also engaging in a protest, which is about religious accommodation. So the religious accommodation here in question is about making space for Muslim students to pray in schools. So here are many of those students in Peel District are South Asian. These are also South Asian people, but they identify as Hindu, some of them as Christian, and they are essentially engaging in an anti-Muslim protest. And that's really the sort of disjuncture or perhaps conjunction that I want to focus on today. And it appears in lots of different ways. So this is a much more scary example. This one is by it's a social media post. I haven't bleeped out the name because the person has been identified widely on social media. The name of the person, Devankar Sharma, is associated with the title of Regional Manager of International Improvements and Partnerships at Laurier University. After this post was made, there was an announcement that a staff member had been suspended from work, but they didn't like person. And what the post says is they have invaded and massacred others, and they stand together in dealing with non-believers. They are not afraid or ashamed of the sins they've committed, but they vow to execute those who didn't believe in jihad. It's again an anti-Muslim, a deeply Islamophobic representation, and it says, educate our children to be away from them. Only casual friendship in class is more than enough. Be proud of our Hindu traditions. Don't invest in anything which has that community as a promoter. Don't buy anything sold by them. And this is in a Facebook group called Canadian Hindu Volunteers. Okay. So when I say violent tolerance, I'm talking about the paradoxical way in which Hindus, and again, I'm not talking about all Hindus, I'm talking about certain loud and quite prominent voices in mainstream discourse in Canada are claiming to be part of a discourse of a discourse of multiculturalism in Canada, cultural pluralism, and to be more Canadian than others, but at the same time are explicitly and violently Islamophobic in the statements that they make. So how do we make sense of what is happening here? So I'm going to try to dig into a little bit of this talk. So I'm going to begin by making the contention that Hindus are racialized differently from other South Asians in Canada and across North America. I'm really interested in the way that Hindu South Asians position themselves as good multicultural subjects in opposition to Muslim and Sikh South Asians whose religious and cultural difference is materially marked and ideologically tainted by the figure of the terrorist. So my intention here is not to collapse Hindu diversity to itself. I really want to make that clear because a lot of my work is concerning how certain voices dominate the representation of Hinduism. So my intention isn't to collapse Hindu diversity into itself, but rather to argue that the public representation of Hindu, made visible through public advocacy and media, offers an image of Hindu that replaces diversity and is only available to certain bodies to occupy. Indian upper caste Hindus are the bodies that can occupy this space. They can mobilize this particular form of goodness in ways that other Hindus, Tamil refugees, for example, cannot. Hindu identities in North America are formed in relation to the hegemonic discourse of Protestant Christian religiosity and also in relation to the transnational hegemony of Hindu India. In the US and in English-speaking Canada, and I'm focusing on Anglophone Canada today, I think there are different and more complex arguments that appear in Francophone Canada. White Protestant Christian narratives of religious and racial acceptability shaped state policies and public attitudes regarding settlements and migration. And one of the key outcomes of this has been the rise, I would argue, of politics of Hindu self-advocacy that is constantly aiming to stake out good, quotation marks, good cultural status. Increasingly, as part of that strategy, Hindu organizations are calling attention to a phenomenon they call Hinduphobia, a concept that appears to invoke and parallel the concept of Islamophobia, but also actually reproduces Islamophobia as we see here. It is Islamophobia in the way it's deployed. This version of Hindu is ideologically and politically powerful. It's not, it is linked to Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, even when it is not explicitly invoking the Hindu state. It is engaging in transnational politics, it has economic power, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. In Canada and across North America, these narratives continue to mediate relations with the state through contemporary discourses of pluralism and multiculturalism. So in this talk, I'm going to first talk about Hindus as a community in Canada formed through the racialization of religion. And then I want to talk about this phenomenon of self-advocacy and this sort of conjunction that I'm talking about between invoking violence and invoking tolerance. Okay, so again, with a little bit of history. Hindus and other South Asians have settled on this land in North America, on Turtle Island, since the late 19th century. Early Hindus and other South Asians arrived here through colonial circuits of labor and exchange, with little access to privilege and power. The first Hindus of South Asian descent settled in the US when Jim Crow laws, as what I was talking about, regulated racial segregation, after the legal end of the enslavement of African descent people. In Canada, too, anti-Black racism drove segregationist policies across the country. In this way, early North American Hindus were both racialized by and were also complicit with the establishment of the United States and Canada as explicitly white Christian settler states. At the turn of the century, Hindus and other South Asians in North America were categorized in different, inconsistent, and unpredictable ways according to their proximity to constructions of whiteness and Blackness. And that's a quote from Gleig book, Bengali Harlem. These categories were further entangled by the narratives of race circulating from colonial India and the British Caribbean. Many South Asian arrivals were called Hindu or Hindu with two O's. These terms refer to a racialized identity category that covered everyone. So all South Asian bodies were called Hindu, but not all of them practiced the religion that we call Hindu today, or earlier versions of them. So that could be Sikhs and Muslims and Christians and Buddhists as well. By early in the 20th century, white Christians in the US and Canada were increasingly uneasy with the flow of migrants from Asia, particularly those from China and India. New regulations were introduced to stem this flow in the US. Immigration policies in 1917 and 1924 limited migration from Asian countries. In Canada, Asians were effectively barred through the implementation of Canada's white supremacist continuous journey policy of 1908. Hindus, Sikhs, and other South Asians strategized against these efforts in a number of ways. South Asians from British India, Sri Lanka, what was called then Ceylon, and the West Indies claimed a right to be in Canada as British subjects, right? So they were people who could have access to British passports. But this argument was poorly received by the public and the government. As was made abundantly clear in the Kamagato Maru case of 1914, South Asians were deemed too racially different from white Christians to be allowed to land in Canada. In the US, some South Asians argued that their racial identity was in fact Caucasian. So there's a whole discourse about the category of Caucasian, or the concept of the Aryan, right, as connected with both European identity, racial identity, and a northern South Asian one that is connected with this argument. That argument met a critical defeat in the case of Bhagat Singh, an Indian Sikh whose request to be recognized as a white citizen of the US. He applied to be recognized as a white citizen as a Sikh man, and it was denied by the Supreme Court in 1923. So it's an attempt for South Asians to claim whiteness officially. The flow of migration from Asia to Canada and the US was effectively stopped by 1924. When paths to immigration opened in the 1960s, ethnically South Asian families from Asia, South Asia, East Africa, Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana came to North America. And this new wave of migration was significantly different in terms of gender and class from those who had come earlier in the end of the previous century. Men in these families were mostly educated professionals, doctors, engineers, professors, mostly among those who are Hindus, upper caste, or those who are non-Hindus had access to class and caste privilege. They often emigrated with wives who were themselves highly educated and worked professionally outside the home. So there's a class component to that wave of migration. While patterns of migration and processes of community building are somewhat parallel in the US and Canada during this period, they begin to diverge in some critical international recruitment and swelling numbers of new settlers brought unease to the predominantly Protestant white citizens of English-speaking Canada and exacerbated the anxieties of Francophone Catholics in Quebec, among whom separatist tensions were already rising. To address this, the government of Canada introduced a policy on multiculturalism in 1971. After the establishment of the Canadian Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, the Multiculturalism Act was passed in 1988. The Act provides it as a policy of the government of Canada, some of you probably know, to, quote, recognize and promote the understanding that multiculturalism reflects the cultural and racial diversity of Canadian society and acknowledges the freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. Okay, so preserve, enhance, and share are the key concepts in that statement. As Himani Banerjee points out, the Act formalizes multiculturalism through the establishment of structures and bureaus, and thereby becomes part of official state discourse. State multiculturalism in Canada supported community initiatives like the building of temples and made the notion of tolerance a part of the national narrative. Lori Beeman has written about the Protestant undercurrent of American and Canadian legal structures governing ideas around tolerance, what she calls, quote, the constitutional privilege of Protestantism. Similarly, Wendy Brown has critiqued the discourse of religious tolerance in the US as a conceit of neutrality that is actually thick with bourgeois Protestant norms. The US didn't establish multiculturalism as policy, but it remains a buzzword that is evoked alongside the narrative of America as a nation of immigrants, right? But I think we all have the sense that there's a different discourse around assimilation in the US that operates in a different way than multiculturalism does. But in both these models, religious freedom and rights discourse is structured around a Protestant understanding of what religion actually is. And that's, I think, a really important thing for us to explore here, right? So the construction of Hindu as a religion is itself essentially a Protestant project. That is a project which ties very closely to the British colonial intervention in India and is something that Tomoko Masuzawa's work on the invention of religion speaks to that history very productively. All of this impacts how Hindu and Muslim South Asians define themselves and the strategies they use to advocate for themselves. Hindus in Canada see themselves as fitting neatly into that multicultural paradigm, while Muslims are perpetually constructed as being outside it. Right? So Hindus are tolerant, Muslims are intolerant. Hindus don't demand for spaces for religious practice in schools, but Muslims do. Right? So those dichotomies are constantly being drawn by South Asians themselves. As a population of Hindus in both Canada and the US has grown exponentially in the last 20 years, experiences of racism and of hate crimes have been a real concern. So I was talking earlier about the second wave, and now I'm talking about third and fourth wave, which also complicates the way we think about class and transnational connections in these communities. Hindu in its modern iteration is very much a racialized religious category. The vast majority of self-identified Hindus in North America can trace their ancestry to South Asia. They are largely a visibly racialized group, but they are not racially distinguishable from South Asians of other religions. Muslims, meanwhile, may be racialized in different ways, but we also probably all have a sense of the racialized stereotypes that are associated with Muslim brown and black folks. Particularly in the post-9/11 era, a significant aspect of the racialization of religion has been the mistaken identity that emerges in the sense of some brown bodies then being mistaken for others. Hindus have long been constructed in the discourse of world religions and philosophy as a benign, meditative, and essentially peaceful community, a contrast to the perception of the violence and terrorism historically associated with South Asian Muslims and Sikhs. Racists, though, are not terribly concerned with distinguishing one from another. So, Jasper Poir has shown very carefully how racialized brown bodies are interchangeable when it comes to those who are ready to enact violence. It doesn't matter what you actually are. What matters is what you look like and what I think you are. Hindus' religiosity is less visible than that of Sikhs and Muslims, especially those whose practices include head coverings or specific styles of dress. The ethnicity still marks them out as foreign and unfamiliar. So, just as an example of that, just after September 11th, 2001, the Hindu Samaj Temple in Hamilton, Ontario, was set ablaze by arsonists, and there was $500,000 in damage. The police initially contacted the local mosque to say something happened, and there's a crisis. Like the arsonists themselves, right? The police mistook the temple for a Muslim faith. More recently, the man who pled guilty to shooting and killing IT specialist Srinivas Kuchibutla and injuring his friend Alok Madhusani, both Hindu immigrants in the US, reportedly bragged about shooting two Iranians. So the sort of interchangeability of brown bodies is a factor here. It's also important to recognize that Hindus have experienced racism and violence that does directly target their religion. There are all kinds of ways that we could explore that. As one example, a recent hate attack a few years ago at the Swami Narayan Hindu Temple in Louisville, Kentucky, the attacker left Jesus is Lord spray painted across the wall in black letters and a cross. A spokesperson for the temple, when they were interviewed by the media, said, "Okay, well, that's all right. Like, we don't have a problem with that. We agree with this. Like, no problem here." So even this sort of performance of like, we're not here to cause trouble. We're the acceptable ones, right? Is sort of visible there. A work in these remarkable comments is a clear attempt to navigate between the need to name and challenge racism on one hand, and on the other, the desire to remain in good relations with Christian neighbors and to not be perceived as criticizing Christian faith. But here I want to pause and think about how we might understand those kinds of actions as being Hindu-phobic in and of themselves. What does that concept mean? I want to think about Islamophobia and Hindu-phobia together. Are Hindus a community who are feared and hated by the dominant culture in the same way as Muslims? That's the sort of core question that I want to ask about Hindu-phobia. And to think about that, I want to, I think I maybe have the wrong order, but I'm going to show you. I mean, this is just like a few days ago that the mosque in St. John's was egged. There was, I didn't put a screenshot in here, there was an axe-wielding attacker at a mosque in Mississauga last week. These kinds of events in Canada are routine. That Muslim places of worship are attacked. Does this happen at the same scale, at the same level? What are the ways that Hindus experience fear, loathing, distrust, anger, and violence? And so I'm going to make the argument that I am not disputing that some Hindus may experience discrimination, may experience violence, may experience harm because of racism. Sometimes that harm is explicitly directed against Hindus who are seen as being involved in a pagan religion. Sometimes it is because all brown bodies are a problem, right, for racists. That is not the same thing as saying that all Hindus are just worthy of mistrust,
are dangerous, are potentially terrorists, which is the rhetoric that we see emerging in Islamophobia. Right? So I'm going to call into contention the notion that there is a thing that is Hindu phobia, which is to imagine that there's an ideological reason why Hindus specifically might be susceptible to harm. And I would contrast that then with thinking about some of the other ways that Hindus occupy public space. As Dr. Gleig talked about, many scholars of Asian religions and Asian American studies have analyzed the notion of the model minority discourse that holds up East Asians and non-Muslim South Asians as good, manageable immigrants who are high achieving, high earning, and resist drawing unwanted attention to themselves, right? Just keep your head down. Hindus benefit from this in ways that South Asian Muslims do not. While some scholars have suggested that Asians are omitted from discussions about racism because it is framed in the US in particular as a black and white problem, that way of thinking about the problem of race fails to recognize the ways in which proximity to whiteness is always at work in locating Asian and brown bodies in different ways. It situates Asians in opposition to Blacks in North America, who are constructed as having lower rates of education and higher rates of criminality. And this is then contiguous with the anti-Black racism that is prevalent in Asian communities. So proximity to whiteness also means needing to distance yourself from Blackness. And that anti-Black racism is then tangled once again with Islamophobia, rooted in as much in North American politics as it is in the casteist, shavist culture of South Asia. And if we just pause for a moment and think about popular culture representations of Hindus, and if anyone watches Never Have I Ever, or Big Bang Theory, or whatever that show was that Aziz Ansari was on, where his character was a Hindu, I can't remember the name of it. What we tend to see are fairly innocuous representations of Hindus in popular culture, where there's a really well documented way of presenting Muslims as dangerous, right, or as villainous in popular culture. So that's a story that's repeated in all kinds of ways. I want to just take a moment to think about how Hindus try to then represent themselves in terms of the sort of notion of advocacy. And this ties in with the idea of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, which bulldozers differences among Hindus in favor of a religious nationalism that centers upper caste Indian Hinduism. And the thing that I've really been trying to argue about Hindutva is that it is no longer just about Hindus as claiming control over India as a state formation. That is the sort of originary point of thinking about Hindutva as a discourse. But Hindu nationalism has become about sort of staking out Hindu identity as a kind of national formation in and of itself, right? A group identity or shared identity. So for the sake of time, I think I won't say too much about the way that Hindutva emerges in India, but I do want to say that Hindu nationalist politics are driven by transnational economic power. And those politics therefore have deep connections in Canada and in the US. There are lots of organizations, there are temples, there are community groups who have lots of money because money is moving back and forth from India to Canada and the US. So they're funded by nationalist organizations. And there are a few scholars who've written about this in detail. I won't say more about the specifics of that at this moment, but I'm happy to talk about it more later. the point that I want to make is that those organizations have in some ways been magnified by the Islamophobia of the Trump and post-Trump era. Those politics are, Hindu politics are reproduced in ways that allow for a claiming of victimhood or victimization at the same time, like sort of like we have been, our power has been taken away. Look how badly we've been treated. At the same time as making that claim for being the most tolerable contributors to a multicultural society. I want to continually underscore here that what I'm trying to get at is that this totalizing discourse of Hinduness that is coming from a group of Hindus, but that it doesn't ever represent all Hindus. And there are lots of ways we can think about that. Many Tamil Hindus, for example, were involved in widespread community actions in Toronto surrounding the end of the Tamil Civil War. And were really criticized by Canadians because they were disrupting traffic and protesting in public in a way that was not in keeping with Canadian values, right? So that's an example of a very different way of occupying public space. But on the other hand, some of the most significant proponents of Hindu-centric ideology in Canada are Indo-Caribbean, right? So I'm thinking of someone like Bhupendranath Dubey, who is the leader of the Vishnu Mandir in Toronto. So Hindutva is not just about linking Hindu identity to Indian nation, right? That's the point that I really want to make clear here. I'll just point to the work of Sanobar Umar and Nishant Upadhyay, who have done amazing work on tracing some of these connections. One area where self-assertion and advocacy has been an ongoing source of debate is with regard to academic discourse on Hinduism, in which the context of Hindu organizations have challenged the dominance of white scholars in the field of Hindu studies. And this is an interesting and complicated problem. The matter involves some legitimate concerns, I think, about self-representation. So it is the academic knowledge about Hindus has been largely produced by white scholars. And that is a process that dates back to colonial South Asia, but continues to operate in the academy, right? So when Hindus of all sort of political stripes are pointing to this as a source of concern, there's truth to it. But what is the reaction to it, right? Or how did they respond to it? So, so that's kind of the piece that I want to try to unpack here. Concern about representation of Hinduism in academia. You can sort of think about this framing around, for example, the recent Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, which took place in the US last fall. Virtual conference with organizers who largely based in the US. When that conference took place, there was a huge community backlash to it. I'm going to just show you an example of one set of reactions to this. So this is from Hindu Forum Canada. Their response to the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference is that they're highly disappointed and displeased with all those groups and universities that are holding and sponsoring Dismantling Global Hindutva. It's a shame that some academia's racism and discrimination towards Hindus and Hinduism is at play at times when Taliban are openly destroying all norms of humanity and human rights, and so-called scholars find pleasure showing their hatred towards Hindus and Hinduism. Okay, so you can spot the Islamophobia, right, in the quote. So I'm going to, like, who is participating in this conference? There are lots of critiques of the conference, which I won't get into here, but what I will say is that I was on a panel in this conference that was all people who are Hindu or Hindu descended, all people who were ethnically South Asian. right? So people who were talking about Hindus from the experience of being, lived experience of being Hindus. So when this statement says it's a shame that some academia's racism and discrimination towards Hindus and Hinduism is at play, I'm wondering who they're talking about, right? And the answer to that can be seen in some of the other ways that this rhetoric unfolds. And I'll use the example, this is the Canadian United Hindu Congress of Canada, and I would like to stress that these are, that such organizations proliferate. It's really hard to tell how many supporters they may actually have, you know, the internet makes it possible for people to be really loud with their voices, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to pay attention to this material. Unholy alliance of radical Islam and the global left. One wonders why these leftist institutions should be religion neutral by definition, right? So think back to that first slide that I showed you about the no religion in schools. Display such hostility against Hinduism while they do even acknowledge, I think it means do not, even acknowledge the crimes of Islam in India. Indeed, this leftist alliance with Islam is not limited to India. The global left is aligned with global Islam in an unholy alliance. Since the leftist ideology is officially atheist, nobody took a vote on that. And Islam is the most radical monotheistic faith. It is uncanny that the two have an agreement. So I find this rhetoric really fascinating, right? And I think that it speaks to some of what is actually happening in the production of this way of understanding what's at work with this national global Hindutva. Where Hindutva was once, like even 10 years ago, perceived of as being a bad thing. Like many diaspora Hindus would say, oh, Hindutva is a bad political regime that is associated with violence. I don't want to be a part of that. When this conference last fall happened, we saw a shift where a lot of Hindu advocacy organizations were suddenly saying, if you're talking about Hindutva, you're talking about us. Any mention of Hindutva means you're being Hinduphobic, right? And so they're sort of claiming it and saying, actually, there's nothing wrong with talking about Hindutva. The term Hindutva means something like, it's often translated as Hinduness, right? So they're saying, well, if it's just an innocent term that means Hinduness, you're insulting my Hinduness if you have a whole conference about ethnic, right? So the idea of Hindu nationalism is being sort of fully integrated into the ways that people think about Hindu identity. I want to connect this with a sort of broader politics. And again, here, I think there's an important connection to be made between Dr. Gleig's work on Buddhism in the US. This is an image from the Canadian Hindu Chamber of Commerce. Super excited to announce session 1 of 8 on how to establish democracy in business. The speaker, Shri Jeffrey Armstrong. Shri Jeffrey Armstrong, also known as Kavinder Rishi, is a professor at the Hindu University of America, which is an explicitly Hindutva-oriented organization that seeks to sort of recuperate the culture, the ancient culture and beliefs of Hinduism, and has a number of white presenting people who are involved with this project. So here's an example of a white scholar of Hinduism that is totally acceptable, right? Whereas in this slide, we talk about this conference, which is actually mostly people of South Asian descent and many people who themselves are Hindu. The claim is that there's something about whiteness that is causing this problem. So actually what is happening here is that some forms of whiteness, the kinds of whiteness that some Hindus want proximity to, are valorized in ways that other forms of whiteness, the atheist left version of whiteness, are refused, right? So there's a new sort of dichotomization around how whiteness is being conceived here. And I think in some ways it does map onto what you said earlier about the sort of elite versus the margin, right? So these are upwardly mobile Hindus who are seeking to locate themselves as part of economically successful middle class, upper class Hindus, right? So that is also in keeping with this. So this is the Ontario Brahmin Samaj. Okay, so this is a caste-based organization. These are people who are like, yes, I am Brahmin. I'm Brahmin by ancestry. I have caste privilege, and I would like to celebrate that ancestry with a bunch of other people who share that. So it's a very explicit acknowledgement that caste still exists in diaspora. So the arguments that people are making at conferences like Dismantling Global Hindutva that caste will exist, we have voices like this one that are saying, no, it doesn't. And yet we also have organizations that are explicitly sharing this. So I'm going off script because I'm a little bit short of time, but I will maybe just end at this point by saying what emerges here for me is the need to make space for different ways of thinking about both Hindu racialization and whiteness in our study of South Asian religions. We have long kind of understood that the thing about Hindu religion, right, or Hindu tradition is what some scholars have called a sort of ethnic religion, is connected with a specific ethnic or racial community, but there's immense diversity in that community. And what we're seeing is that voices that have political and economic power. I'm going to tell you that the Canadian Hindu Chamber of Commerce also was having really excited to host a meet and greet with Pierre Poilievre. They're really locating themselves in a particular conservative politics in Canada in a way that claims Canadianness, right, and the idea of tolerance, while also violently demonstrating explicitly claiming hate and fear for Muslims. And so I think what I'll do is I'll stop there and say that we can have a conversation about what that means for the academic study of these traditions, which I think is the next stage of this conversation. Okay, thank you.
Again, we have some time for some direct questions for Dr. Krishnamurti. If anybody's got some to get us started.
Unless somebody else wants to jump in. Thank you so much, both of you, for this discussion this afternoon. It's going to be really great to get a chance to really talk further. That's one question that I had about what we can emphasize here is somehow the structuring is significance of Islamophobia in the politics of Hindu in this context. I'm just wondering, there's a lot to talk about there. There's one thing that I'm wondering about is that first slide, or maybe it was the second, that had the Facebook post. I'm not sure Jasmine Zine was quite involved with is that if you're thinking about how to place the kind of paradoxes of that particular political discourse, because that image also had a Save Palestine image as at the bottom of it of somebody identifiably Muslim, maybe Palestinian, I don't know, but suppressing Hindus and Sikhs and all about Kashmir and of course Hindus in Pakistan, and so they're dealing with consequences of religious nationalism and the partition of India, but positioning themselves in anti-Palestine politics. I wonder if you could think of some of the analogies and also some of the arguments about Hindu phobia being imported from anti-Palestine Jewish Zionist types of argument about that. It seems like there's a lot of interplay there, that there's a kind of affiliation with that, which is, to say that, of course, there is something like anti-Hindu in the ways that you were talking about, racialization, discrimination, in the same way that, of course, there is anti-Semitism, but the way it's deployed and constructed is a particular thing I'm wondering if you're thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for drawing attention to the bottom of this image. And so for people who can't quite see the text from where they are, it's an image of what is a male presenting figure dressed in Muslim clothing and on the standing on a pile of skulls. And on the left, it says Pakistan, and then in brackets it says Hindu, and on the other side it says India, and then in brackets it says Kashmiri Hindu Pandit. And the rest of the image and that pile of skulls identifies other Hindu communities that have been harmed or victims of violence Okay, so there's something happening there in placing those stories together, and it clearly suggests that to save Palestine can only be done on the bodies, on the backs of Hindu victims, right? I mean, that's the intention of this image. There's a very strong connection between the way that Hindu nationalism or Hindutva as a discourse has unfolded in a global context and its connection to Zionist or Israeli nationalist discourse. And saying that not just in terms of the political, the geopolitical relationship between India and Israel, but also in terms of the they're not being stuck.
No, I'm trying to
That's okay. In terms of the ways in which the language of anti-Semitism and defamation has been deployed, right? So the notion of Hindus as a minority group who can be defamed borrows really heavily from the ways that Hindus have observed Jews in Canada and the US organize around anti-Semitism. But they don't have the same narrative, the historical narrative of minoritized violence, genocide that Jews might have a claim to. So what's happening here is a claim to the experience of genocide, and that's why the story of Kashmiri Hindu Pandits is featured here prominently. And for those of you who are all interested in what's going on in South Asian media, there's this new film that's called The Kashmir Files, and like some of these organizations that I'm talking about are like trying to take big groups of people, buy out theaters, take ticket, go have a sort of community viewing experience, because it's the film is a very nationalist, Narendra Modi approved representation of the plight of Kashmiri Hindu Pandits, right? So I'm not sure if that story is clear for everyone, but I'll just say that the narrative of the occupation, the Indian occupation of Kashmir, has rested on the idea that Kashmiri Hindu Pandits were a victimized minority group in Muslim majority Kashmir, right? So that's a way of claiming a victim narrative. So that partly answers your question.
Yeah. I was just wondering, you had mentioned that a lot of Hindus are sort of caught between the typical black-white dichotomy of the United States and racial views there. Is there a consistent way that Hindus align themselves? Like, do they view themselves as white, as in between, as black? Like, how would they center themselves in that discussion?
I think it's an interesting question. I don't think that I've ever encountered Hindus who see their brownness as proximate to even in Caribbean contexts, what tends to happen is it's an insistence on a distinction. Right? That can get complicated, but I think that the desire to distinguish oneself as a person of South Asian origin rather than a person of Black African origin is really something that happens a lot. I think the idea of desire in whiteness or proximity to whiteness is sometimes really explicit. You know, I mean, like perhaps not as explicit as the case with the bucket sing thinned, but still happens in lots of different ways. But I think more so, the current climate around ways that we think about race means that Hindus think of themselves as a racial minority group. And the difference, the thing that I'm trying to point at is that where South Asian is a broad category that might include lots of different people, lots of different ethnic and religious identities, and has been a politically useful category for organizing across some of the artificial boundaries that produces, the Hindu does something different, right? It claims that ethnic identity, that sort of shared ethno-religious identity, and makes that the center, right, instead. And so I think that's actually the alternative. It becomes the alternative to being caught in between, so to speak.
So thank you so much for that brilliant talk. I learned so much. I was taking it furiously. A couple of questions. One is, how have Hindu responded to scholars like yourself who have, you know, the first person kind of location, and how have you navigated that? I know it can be an emotional cost. And then the second question was, in the shift towards the Hindu diaspora being more claiming Hindu Torah, you know, this kind of worrying development. Are there generational differences? Are the younger Hindus who are disrupted? Like, what's resistance?
Okay, so to answer the second question first, it actually kind of comes back to what Ryan asked just now. And I think that the second generation, so one of the places we're seeing this kind of discourse of Hindu identity emerging most strongly is on university campuses, right? And if I use the example of Rutgers University, which is where a Sanskrit scholar, Audrey Trishke, teaches. So she's a white scholar of South Asia. She's been widely vilified by the Hindu right. The Hindu Students' Council there is organizing, actually on Sunday, they're having a big conference about understanding Hindu phobia, right? As a reaction to what has emerged around this conference that I mentioned. So I think that second generation students and more recent, so students, international students who are coming more recently from South Asia are, I think, participating in those spaces and are kind of lifting up that discourse. In response to like how we are perceived, I will say, so when I spoke on this panel that I mentioned at Dismantling Global Buddhism, and I co-presented a paper with a colleague of mine with whom I collaborate in this group called the Feminist Critical Hindu Studies Collective. She's based in Kentucky. She got death threats, right? Like they got death threats into her office, her work email, people threatening her. I mean, you know, these are like threats saying, like, we know where you live, like that kind of stuff. I was like, I told can't be death threats. I honestly think it is because as someone located in Canada, located at a small university in Eastern Canada, that I just wasn't on their radar in quite the same way as some of my other colleagues. But that's certainly something which has happened, and I know of other South Asian scholars in Canada who are very critical of this kind of Hindu rhetoric, who have experienced really serious threats of violence and of harm to themselves and their families as a result of doing this kind of work. So I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, it's you know, some like this kind of like don't talk to them, don't invest in them, and that thing that I showed you about you know, the mistrust of the left. I think we, you know, I'm going to speak about my sort of scholarly community. I think we're all racialized scholars, and I think that we are really situated as being part of this mistrust of the left, right?
Yeah.
that we're contributing to the production of a bad ideological take on Hindus, an anti-capitalist one, and an anti-national one.
I really appreciate the work and the bravery in it.
I mean, thank you for saying that. I mean, I feel like it was really important. I mean, I'm being like, facetious myself. I didn't just do Dutch reps, but I really want to acknowledge the work of the Muslim scholars who have been doing this work and really are doing it in ways that are putting their bodies and their families' bodies on the line. Like, I think, for me as somebody who has access to upper caste privilege, much in the way that you've talked about whiteness. So like, I think it's my job to do this kind of work and to intervene in public spaces where I can, but I'm not the first one to do it. And, just trying to lift up some of the voices of others too.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's probably a good place to stop. And we are going to have a break for now.